I am going to jump in. I know there'll still be some others joining us. We have quite a few signed up for this group coaching call with Katie Cole, but I'm going to get started and I'll let them join in. I want to appreciate all of your time. My name is Darren Young. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Leadership Network and really thrilled to be hosting this time with you. And especially thrilled because we get to spend time with Katie Cole, who's just absolutely one of my favorite people and an absolutely incredible and brilliant leader. And so it's going to be a great dynamic time that we have. Let me give you just a few things up front so that we can maximize our time together. One is while Katie's sharing and while others are speaking, if you can just keep yourself on mute. Most of you know this, but if you can just keep yourself on mute, that will be great. And that'll allow us to not have distractions from those who are sharing. As well, for those of you who just signed in, it's wonderful. Some of you have already done it, but if you just go to the top, if you go to the top three dots in your picture and just go rename and put your city beside your name, that would be great. Just gives us a picture of where you're coming from. That'll be fantastic. And also, I want to encourage you, the way we're going to run this is I'm going to have a conversation with Katie. Katie and I are going to dialogue a little bit about leadership and staff and developing female leaders specifically in that, but a broader conversation than just that. And while we're doing that, I want to encourage you to feel free to, in the chat function, be putting in questions that you have that you would love Katie to speak into. And then after I dialogue with Katie for a little bit, we're going to have an opportunity to interact with Katie. And you'll have a chance to interact with her and ask her questions. But it's helpful for me when some of them go into the chat, because then I can start seeing what might be a great next part to the conversation, giving you an opportunity to jump in on it and navigate our time so we can maximize the next hour. And so that's how we're going to go on this. And I'm praying that it's going to be, last week, some of you who were on our call with Dan Ryland, it was just a super dynamic time. And I'm praying the same for this time. So let me pray, and then we're going to get going. All right. Father, I'm real thankful for this group, and I'm real thankful for our opportunity we have to connect with Katie. Father, I'm praying just so much blessing. I'm praying you would provide the wisdom and insight that each person here needs. They have real questions and real challenges, and they need your understanding, how to navigate that in their leadership, maybe in their home, maybe with their family, or most certainly with their church. And so I pray you would be gracious to us today to that end. We love you, and we pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. It's good to see all you. I know some of you just tuned in. So if you tuned in after I said my name is Darren Young. I'm with Leadership Network and just really thrilled to host this. I'm going to try to do minimal talking because your wisdom is going to come from Katie today. I'm just going to say this one thing up front, though, because I get the question every time I'm on one of these calls is, yes, I'm in a trailer. All right. That is my backdrop. It's a real trailer. It's not a virtual backdrop. And so this is where I've been working. It's on our driveway, but I've been working here for the last 13 weeks or so. So it is a trailer. That's exactly, you're right. That's what it is. All right. So, but I want to jump in. Katie Cole, some of you know Katie because you've been blessed by her. You've read her recent book, which I'll talk about. You've been in a leadership cohort or coaching with her, or you've just heard who she is. If you don't know who Katie is, let me give you the quickest glimpse. Katie Cole has been in leadership in the church for many years now. She was the executive director at Christ Fellowship in Florida, and Christ Fellowship is a church of, what is it now, Katie, about 25,000 or so? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Katie was involved from the time they were about 3,000 and grew through various leadership roles. She became their executive director, overseeing their 9 campuses, and really built that whole multi-site movement for their church. She's an exceptional leader. When she stepped down, they replaced her with 3 or 4 people, literally replaced her with 3 or 4 people. She has a master's in human resources with a focus on transformational leadership. She coaches and consults with churches regularly on how to build leadership pipelines and structures and organizational design and all that is involved in that. She's been a partner with Leadership Network for many years now and has been at the heart of some of our executive pastor networks where she is one of our key mentors. She developed Developing Female Leaders leader group itself, and she's been journeying last year with developing executive female leaders. She also this last year wrote a book which really came out of that, and we're going to talk about some of it today, called Developing Female Leaders, which is an absolutely exceptional book that you need to read, and we'll get you a link to that resource afterwards. So when we talked about who would we love for you to gather around and get some coaching with, Kadi Cole was top of the list. And what Kadi and I want to do is, as I said before, is I want to chat with Kadi for a little bit. I'm going to interview her, and then you're going to have lots of opportunity to interact with her. So be putting your questions in the chat, and then I'll give you those moments to do that. Kadi and I want to talk about staffing and leadership. Where we want to start, though, is talking about developing female leaders, which for some of you on that topic, you immediately say, that's fantastic, because that's why I came here. I knew Kadi was kind of the expert on this. God's positioned her on it. I want to hear from it. And others of you are saying, that's a good topic, but I've got other leadership and staffing issues I really need to tackle. So do we need to focus a ton there? But there's a very specific reason, and I think in this cultural moment, a very specific reason that this is absolutely pertinent, not simply on the issue of developing female leaders, but leadership pipelines in the church in general. And so Kadi and I are going to chat about that, and you're going to see very, very quickly why this matters for you and your church. So Kadi, let's start there. You wrote this book, Developing Female Leaders, but you are, for any of us who know you well, probably the last person I would think that would actually write this book. And so talk a little bit about that. Talk about what led you to write this book, which has received rave reviews and been very successful this last year. But talk about what led you to write this book. And then from there, I want to talk about why it matters so much for staffing and leadership in general.
Well, thanks. That's a great question. And hi, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. So thanks for taking the time. I wrote this book. It was kind of a surprise to me also, actually. I've been in leadership, especially in church spaces, for a long time. But my real passion is helping churches get effective in fulfilling their mission. And that's really what I've focused my time in my own church ministry about. It's what I do most of my consulting at, is helping strategize clarity and focus around mission, and then creating the organizational framework to see that come to fruition. And as I was working with churches, we really started running into this leadership development lid. People had a lot of vision. I feel like in the church space, we have more than enough vision. Most people had a lot of resources, either buildings or finances or space that they could utilize, but they did not have enough qualified and trustworthy leaders. And it was really putting a damper on their capacity to fulfill what they thought God was calling them to. And as I started to dig deeper with a few churches, what we started to realize is that there were some inherited systems and ways of thinking about leadership development that was really keeping a big population, in fact, multiple populations, out of their pipelines. At the same time I was doing this on the consulting side, I was working with Leadership Network, running cohorts for multi-site churches on how to expand their multi-site ministries. And in that process, had a series of 3 different senior pastor and executive pastor teams ask me about how to do a better job with the women in their staff team, what they could do to develop their skills better, what they could do to recruit more women leaders, which I've been in ministry like over 20 years. I've never had anyone ask me those kind of questions before. So it was really encouraging to me. This was a couple of years ago. I feel like the conversation has really blossomed since then, but at the time it was still really sort of a silent topic. And so what I started to find out from those 3 pastor teams and the work I was doing is that these were really great pastors, excellent leaders, very godly men who were trying to help women do more and better in their churches. And they were from totally different theological backgrounds, different parts of the country, different size churches, different kinds of ministries, but they all had this sense that they were missing out, or they saw potential in women that they knew well. Maybe it was someone they knew, like their wife or their daughter. Maybe it was just they could see there was this great woman leader who was successful in business, but doing 0 volunteering in his church. And so it was a unique sort of broad spectrum of people that were all struggling with this. And so I started doing some research about how these guys could do a better job. And then in these churches I was working with, we found that women were just not putting themselves into leadership. They had opportunity. The churches would even say, we want women on our staff. We want to, have women leaders. But for some reason, they just couldn't break the barrier of actually women entering the training pipelines or getting into some leadership roles. And so that disconnect between these guys who are trying to do a good job and these women who wanted to do leadership but couldn't really find their way easily, that space really intrigued me. And so I'm kind of a research nerd. So I started a big research project to figure out how we could do better at that. I appreciate and love the theological debate about this. I appreciate inspirational things about women stepping up and finding their voice. But my INTJ profile really wanted to understand what was actually going wrong and what were the action steps that we as leaders, as leadership teams, could actually practically do to make this better. As I started researching it, I discovered, as most of you probably know, we are at some really upside down statistics, not only with women, but in fact, all minorities in most churches. Women is the topic I happen to take on the first, but I'm actually passionate and I'm so excited about many of the conversations that have been stirred up in the last few weeks about minorities and how that fits with our faith and how we look at our churches and how are we as leaders being good at being diversified in our leadership and our choices, because that's been really an internal passion of mine that I have felt like, and for the last couple of years have been championing this idea of including more women in our leadership, because if we could actually learn how to do that better, we'll probably also learn how to do many other minorities different. And the reason is because women are actually not technically a minority in most churches. Actually, they're the majority. Most churches in America are made up of 61% women. 61%, and all of you who are in ministry know that because you look out at the congregation and you see it. And I am, I should clarify, a huge proponent of get the dad, get the whole family. I am very passionate about ministries towards men because I think church is hard for many men to navigate, and we've not done a great job making space for many men in our ministries. But when it comes to our leadership ranks, even though women are the majority of the church, when it comes to formalized leadership roles, they make up less than 10% of them, less than 10. So they're 61% of the congregation, but less than 10% of the leaders. And that causes all sorts of things to be upside down when we make decisions. We're missing out on a whole lot of potential and productivity that happens when we add different perspectives to our leadership teams. We don't have good representation when we're trying to figure out ministry decisions. Many people in the congregation feel like they don't know how to be a part of it, or that they're not welcome in the ministry simply because they don't see people like them. So this happens with age, this happens with race, this happens with gender, it happens with physical abilities. So if you have folks that have physical disabilities, many disqualify themselves from leadership because they don't think there's a way for them to access that. And what we found is that many of us who have been in ministry a long time, I entered the doors of the church for the first time when I was in the second grade, and I've sort of been all in since that. So I think and breathe and operate in a church mindset. And many of the things, though, that we have either inherited or grew up with or just made assumptions about are really not serving us well anymore in not only our own mission, but also in the context of ministry in which we're doing it, with a world that has shifted their viewpoints on many of these things quite significantly. And I should just say, I come from a wide variety of different church backgrounds, different theological bents. I've had really beautiful spiritual growth and leadership opportunities in many different theological backgrounds. To me, this is not necessarily a theological issue, although that obviously has some implications into what you invite women or even other types of people into leadership. What we found in our research is that the theological stance of a church had almost nothing to do with how effective they were at using women in leadership. It came down to the individual practices of the top level leaders and the kinds of leadership cultures that they were creating. That is a pretty remarkable finding, because most of us have assumed that the issue of women in leadership is a binary issue. I either am for women or I'm against women. That's kind of what it feels like, especially to the women. And so to sort of unpack this, that actually there are some really conservative, you might know them even as complementarian churches, who have women thriving in leadership roles in almost every level of leadership in their organization. And we have some very progressive churches, also known as egalitarian churches, who are proponents of women in leadership, but have almost no women in higher levels of leadership in their church. What it really comes down to is how good are we as leaders being inclusive? What's our language like on the weekend? What are we modeling? What are our hiring practices like? Are we actually going after people that might not realize that we would not only welcome them in the ministry, but we actually would love them to come? One of the interesting pieces of research we found, which I found really shocking, is that when men and women apply for jobs, they look at the opportunity to apply for a leadership role very differently, whether this is a promotion in their workplace or a volunteer role that you might have at your church. Men and women read the job description differently. If a guy looks at a job description and he reads through it and he feels good of about 60% of what's on that job description, he thinks, I'm going to apply. I'll probably get the job. If I don't know what I'm doing, I'm going to like Google it, or I'll wing it, or I'll call my dad, but I'm going to figure it out as I go, and I'm going to go for this role. Well, when a female leader, and oftentimes many other minority leaders, when they look at a job description, exact same job description, they think something completely different. They go through it, and particularly women, if they don't feel confident about every single thing on the job description from day one, they won't even apply for the job. Think about that. They won't even apply. Now, as leaders, we know, especially in church ministry, when we're dealing with a lot of volunteer roles, right? Volunteers are like the best interview process ever for hiring. So even in a volunteer role, women are looking at that and they're like, man, this is a whole new job. This is something I've never done before. I don't even know what a couple of those things are. And there's no way I can do a great job from the very first day. I'm going to disappoint my pastors. I'm going to disappoint myself. I'm going to disappoint God. I better not even apply or even let anyone know I would ever consider that job. Well, as leaders, one of the ways we find other leaders to develop is they put their name in the hat. They raise their hand. They volunteer. They show up. And so right away, even before we have a conversation with a female leader, she's already taking herself out of qualification because she doesn't know that she can do it perfect from the beginning. So things like that help us realize that as leaders, it's not just about saying we want women to apply, or we write on our job description, men or women are welcome to apply for this role, although those are really important things to do. It's also taking the extra step to say, you know what, we need to go after some people that have not felt like they were a part of our team or could be a part of it. And so meeting with some women who are leaders and saying, hey, just so you know, here's the job description. And by the way, you already do 8 of these 10 things excellently. I know you're scared to be the director of the greeter team, but you've been a greeter for 27 years. You already coordinate 2 services. You are the one person who shows up every week. There is no reason why you shouldn't apply and probably get and absolutely thrive in this job. Would you please consider applying? We would really love to consider you for this. Even the conversation that lets her know that you look at her differently than she measures herself helps her in many different ways. You can say things like, hey, just so you know, you don't have to be great at this from the beginning. We spend 6 months with you teaching you how to do it, letting you shadow people. We would expect that it would take you a year before you felt fully confident of it. There's all sorts of ways to sort of help a woman or any other person you're recruiting to a job make sure that what is they're thinking about and the way they're measuring themselves matches the way you're measuring them. So that's just a couple examples, Darren, of some of the things that we learned in the research. And now I'm sure all of you you're reading articles and books on all sorts of minorities and how to be inclusive, particularly around race and ethnic backgrounds. All of the kinds of principles we found for women are actually multiplied for women of color because it's very consistent across the board. And when we're talking about diversity and mixing up our teams, this isn't something where suddenly we need to all feel pressure that we have to have 50% of every possible kind of person on our teams. The research would say what we're really looking for is 30% of your leadership teams is the place to start. 30% of your leadership teams aren't like everybody else on your team. So if you have 10 people on your leadership team and they all look kind of the same. I work with a lot of churches, and I'm sure this isn't your church, but most of them are like middle-aged guys. They're sort of bald. They're wearing a plaid button-down shirt. They got a couple kids at home. They're doing all of those things, and they all kind of are the same profile. Half of them are like related to each other or went to college together. They're all kind of the same person. You don't have to fire all those people, but 2 or 3 or 4 of those guys, as they open up, or if you can go recruiting, just 3 or 4 of your team of 10 could be someone else. It could be someone who's older. It could be someone who's younger. It could be someone who's female. It could be a couple people from different backgrounds. You want to mix it up so that when someone who doesn't look like that comes to your church, they go, oh, there's a lot of different kind of people on their leadership. There's a lot of different perspectives speaking into what we're doing. I wonder if God might ever actually use me to do something more than simply attend or just do what I'm doing. It gives vision and hope for people who think God might want to ask more of them in the leadership space.
Kadi, I'm so thankful for this moment we're having this conversation because, as you pointed to a number of times, this is critical on several fronts. And in terms of the way God has brought to the very surface right now racial injustice, this is really, really critical because as churches, there's all these issues that we fight for. We fight for it in our communities. We fight for our church to care about it. But then at the same time, in leadership and our staffing and our leadership pipelines, we are not being intentional with them. And so right now, systemic racial injustice is a major priority for churches, as it should be, because there's so far we need to go on that. But at the same time, as leadership, we're not addressing what you're specifically speaking of on various fronts, whether it be racial justice, whether it be gender, whether it be age, whatever the case might be, because your heart in this, as you described, is I want to see a church thrive through their leadership pipeline and see all people engaged as God would have them, and see the church have full capacity in the mission that God has given them. So this is something for us as leaders. If we're saying our churches care about these issues, we better be meeting with our leadership teams. I just want to drive what Kadi's saying. We better be meeting with our leadership teams in this season, or at the appropriate moment in this. You've got a lot on your plate. I do understand that. But we better be meeting and addressing what is our plan, because as Kadi started touching on, we're going to talk a little bit more about it. It doesn't just happen because you say, hey, we want to be representative in our leadership. You're going to have to be very, very intentional. And Kadi gave a few examples with females, how it won't happen unless you are. And that's true across the board. Now, Kadi, you have a couple terms you use in terms of floors and ceilings, and I want you to talk about those a little bit and give some examples on what we as leaders need to be focusing on to make sure we are developing a thriving leadership pipeline.
Sure. One of the terms you maybe have heard about is the glass ceiling, which is sort of this invisible barrier that happens in organizational structures. It's usually not connected to individual people. It's one of the things I mentioned earlier, these sort of maybe hiring practices or habits that we have in our church systems that you as a leader might not even be aware of, that are actually limiting women's potential and growth. One example from my own story was when I took my first leadership role at a church. I'd been recruited from a university where I was a dean over student development. The church that Darren mentioned, Christ Fellowship, was just a few thousand people, and they were looking for someone to come in and help with the organizational structure and really scaling for growth and taking some leadership of some departments and helping them move forward in a high growth environment. So the senior and executive pastor hired me to come in and sort of be a spot person on their behalf, figuring those things out. Well, when I went to make my first hire of someone who would report to me, who was a man, overseeing all of our weekend logistics and some of our production pieces, he ended up getting this job offer that was so much more than what I was getting. So because he was a man, he was automatically given a pastoral title. He was given full benefits for him, his wife, and all of his kids, like insurance benefits. He got more retirement contribution. He was licensed for ministry, which meant he got a tax discount. And I was like, that's kind of weird. Like, does that happen in church, that you oversee people with like many more benefits than you? And what had happened is that in the HR practices, I was apparently the first woman who came in at a leadership role, but in the HR clerical team, all women went into the secretarial benefits package, and all men, regardless of your position, went into the pastoral benefits package. And so this was an old practice that wasn't really relevant to where we were at anymore, but the church, it was, 20 years old at that point, and the thing they set up in the first couple of years had lasted that long, and no one had ever really noticed it or questioned it or come across it. So those are examples of glass ceilings. So for me, I mean, my pastors were wonderful. I knocked on the door and said, hey, what's up with this? And they're thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's how that went down, and they fixed it, and it was great. But for other kinds of women who maybe didn't have the same professional experience I had to know to do that, could have looked at that or found out about that and thought, they don't think I matter. They don't think I'm actually doing ministry. They don't value my work ethic. And so these glass ceilings start to pop up, both formally, like we literally don't want you in higher levels, but also internally, where we start sending messages in our culture that are not at all what we intended, but their message is being sent anyway. Those are kind of the glass ceiling pieces. What's even more interesting, though, is what we call the sticky floor. Similar to what I was talking about, how women look at job descriptions differently. These are things that happen inside a woman's mentality, the dialogue she has for herself, the training she's received from growing up in church environments or her home, where there were certain biases about gender that actually keep her stuck to the floor and prevent her from moving forward in leadership. The job description piece is one. Another example would be something called imposter syndrome. Perhaps you've heard of this. Now, many men suffer from imposter syndrome too, but statistically speaking, women have this much greater, particularly when they walk into a leadership environment filled mostly with men. And so they walk in and they think to themselves, I don't really belong here. Right? Like, I don't think like these guys. Do they know I'm not like any of them? I don't have a pastor's wife at home having dinner ready for me. Like, I'm schlepping it through Chick-fil-A on the way home, hoping my kids eat in the back and don't choke as I drive to soccer practice. Like, I don't know as much. Maybe I didn't go to seminary, or I didn't graduate as them, or I'm not as young as them. Like, all these things happen. I think most guys particularly would be shocked to realize how much dialogue is happening in a woman's head as she's trying to lead, particularly in environments where she doesn't see a lot of other female leaders. So those are things called the sticky floor. And for us as leaders, particularly if you're in a high level leadership role, or if you are a man who's trying to help develop or raise a female up on your team, your capacity to speak into that is huge. I cannot explain to you how much your affirmation, your feedback, your vision, speaking truth over someone, I can't tell you how much that means to someone who has not gotten much of that in their developmental years. When I speak with most guys who are leading in church, I'm like, tell me about what it was like to grow into ministry. And it almost always starts off with, oh my gosh, I was 16 and my grandpa who ran a church, or the senior pastor, invited me up to give my first, message. And I was so nervous and I threw up beforehand and there was nothing to teach on in the Bible. And, they go through all of these things, or they talk about this mentor who saw himself in them or invited them to a conference, or these luncheons they had with an elder, all of these amazing developmental opportunities, which do make for a really strong, great ministry career. But almost no women have any stories like that. So when you are raising up women, even if they're older, even if they're in their 40s or 50s and they've been around the church forever, and you think of them as a spiritual giant in the leadership space, when you look at them and say, hey, let me give you some feedback on that message, or you say, oh my gosh, it matters so much to me that you're on the platform on the weekend, or thank you so much for sharing that different perspective in that decision we were making. We would have totally missed that had you not been there. Your perspective and your voice carries so much more weight because we're coming at these opportunities with a deficit. And you really hold the key to helping us find our leadership, maximize what God has given us, and most importantly, contribute to the church and the mission that we're all trying to work towards. So those are some key things to remember. The glass ceiling, are you looking at your systems and structures? Are you sending a message you don't mean to be sending? And then the sticky floor, how can I come alongside the women in my life or in my leadership and affirm the things that maybe someone else hasn't taken the time or even noticed to affirm in them? Because I see God in them. I want them to see God in them also.
I really encourage each of you to pick up Kadi's book, Developing Female Leaders, if you haven't, and we'll send a follow-up with a connection to that resource. But one of the principles in the book, and Kadi knows I love this so much, that she had encouraged me with, and she encourages in the book, is every leader, especially every male leader, especially, needs to go back and sit down with a female leader or a female volunteer staff member, whoever it is, and ask this person in your church, what's it like to be a female leader in our church? And so I did this. I went back to our church after a conversation with Kadi, and I asked one of our young female leaders, what's it like to be a female leader in our church? And I really thought that I was really sensitive to female leaders. I'm a proponent of developing female leaders. I thought that I was like an 8 or 9 out of 10 on this thing. Like I wasn't perfect, but I was expecting a pretty fantastic response. And it was an hour and a half conversation of this female leader just describing things that I had never recognized or thought of, that I was blind to in our church. So I really encourage you, whether it is female leaders, whether it is racial minorities, whether it is like Kadi described, your church is all middle age or it's all millennials, staff members, but those who are not your norm, that don't look like you, and sitting down and saying, what is it like to be a leader or a volunteer or a staff member in our church, is to have that conversation, because you're going to find out some things that you never, ever recognize, which is going to be super, super valuable. What I want to do now is I want to open it up. There's so many more things that we could share on this, but
Darren, can I just say one thing about that question? I just want to encourage you, particularly because I've been working in this space for a while, and have been spending the last year really pursuing the topic of racial minorities in churches. Because again, I feel like this is a the female leader conversation is really a door opener to that conversation. And I'm just amazed at how God has accelerated that in all of our churches, within a few weeks. I just want to encourage you that wherever you're at in your progress on this, as someone who has been on the receiving end of this, and as someone who is trying to, in my own way, learn more about racial disparity and what the biases that I have that I want to reflect on and do the very same things I challenge my guy pastor friends to do. It doesn't matter where you're at. It matters that you're moving on it. It matters that you're asking the question. It matters that you're reading more. It matters that you're trying to figure it out. We are not going to be perfect at this. We never have been, but I'm telling you, the women who are longing to lead in your church are going to appreciate that question, even if it doesn't come out exactly right. And I believe too, because I have enough friends that have told me, like, just even me asking, help me understand what it's like. What should I be doing? I feel like right now, all you have to do is Google it. You don't even have to ask a real person. You just need to be following some folks and reading up on it. Educating ourselves is the first level of responsibility. It's not up to women to help men understand what are the barriers. It's up to the leaders to educate themselves and knock down barriers for their people. That's what leadership is. And as you ask questions and as you learn more, there is grace and compassion on the journey. We all know these are hard things. And we know because we've been living it for way longer than the people who are finally starting to look at it. So don't be discouraged. Please don't let Satan use fear or any other thing that would keep you from asking. At least dip your toe in the water. At least be the kind of leader who leans into the awkwardness and doesn't retreat from it. I think we're at a pinnacle moment, and I think there's an openness on both sides to make steps forward. But as leaders, we're the ones with privilege, whatever that privilege is that we all have to even be on this call. We're the ones who have to take this step, and there's opportunity for us if we choose to embrace that and not hold back from the opportunity God's given us.
Yeah, thanks, Kadi. I love what you just said, that part of our job description as leaders is to break down barriers. And I think if we can embrace that out of this call and be intentional about it, that's going to be significant for your church. I want to start opening up some of the conversation and interaction and give you an opportunity to ask Kadi questions. And so the way I'd love to do it is, if you would, in the chat, if you would share some questions you have, things you'd love for her to speak into. It might be really specifically on what she's been talking about, but Kadi and I also wanted to open it up to staffing and leadership pipelines beyond simply this specific issue, because that's a broader heart, as Katie shared. So you can start sharing those in the chat, and then I'll give you an opportunity to ask them, and we'll be able to navigate the conversation that way. Katie, just to start that off, why some of the group here is putting some things in the chat. One of the questions that came in ahead of time was from Scott. And Scott, if you want to ask that, you just ask. I mean, this is all part of it. It begins in the home. You had a question right from your home.
Yeah. Hey, Katie. I have 2 daughters at home. And I mean, they're 5 and 2, so they're not like leaders. But as a dad, I just want to know if you had any insight on how I can help develop the female leaders that live in my house.
Oh, what a great question. I love that. You know what's so interesting, Scott, is they found that women who actually go on to break through glass ceilings in environments that are harder for most women to navigate, they found that one of the most strategic and critical factors is a strong dad who saw leadership in them as little girls. And so your role becomes incredibly important. And when we did our survey, we surveyed over 2,000 women who were working in church ministry on the factors that help them be in ministry leadership. One of the most surprising statistics was that most of them, over 90% of them, had their leadership affirmed in them before the age of 19. Before the age of 19, someone, a parent, a teacher, a coach, a pastor, some old lady in the, old women's Bible study saw it, whoever it was, looked at them and said, you have leadership. You are significant. What you do matters. These are your gifts that God gave you to use in the kingdom. Some sort of affirmation. And because it was done young enough, they actually grew up thinking of themselves as a leader. Most of the women that I coach now who struggle with sticky floor or imposter syndrome, most of what we talk about is shifting the internal paradigm that they never saw themselves as a leader. So if you don't see yourself as a leader, it's really hard to step into leadership. It's really hard to give direction. It's hard to learn how to delegate because those are leadership skills. And so the mentality becomes really different. So what you say really matters. I would say if you've got 2 girls and that's it, one of the most important things is to teach them how to steward their leadership. One of the important elements about women in leadership in our country is that most of the women that are hitting some ceilings and some sticky floor issues are over the age of 30. Our millennial sisters are having a great time growing into leadership. Their imposter syndrome and sticky floor is much less than their older sisters, but they haven't always known how to grow or steward their leadership in a way that actually allows them to work intergenerationally. And so for girls that young, speaking leadership, helping them see themselves in the Bible by teaching women who are in the Bible, not just men in the Bible, and then helping them interact with people of different ages and letting them lead in context. So going old, this is what I would do if I were you. I'd go old school. I'd be taking my girls into the nursing home and having them sing songs and do coloring with older people. I would be having them come to the choir practice at the church and set up cookies in the back and serve coffee at the break, getting them connected with generations above them because those are going to be the people they work for, learning their language, learning how to navigate them, understanding respect, but then growing in leadership with those people around them. That's the magic sauce. I can do and contribute and lead in a way in which the people who are in eldership to me see it, affirm it, and love it.
Thanks, Katie. Arlena, you had a question that kind of piggybacks off what Scott just asked. So I want to give you an opportunity to ask that question.
Hi, Katie. Great to meet you. Love your book. Love your book. So I am an executive pastor, and I have a wonderful opportunity to mentor and lead a ton of amazing women leaders. And I know your book is designed to hand to my lead pastor, and we talk through that, and our campus pastors who are all guys. But I just was going to say, what's one key piece of advice that you would have for me as I develop a pretty significant team of female leaders?
Oh, gosh, I just love that. And by the way, I would love to connect with you, or on my website is a link to our Women's Executive Pastor Network, which I don't think you're in. So would love to have you learn more about that. I think you would love it. Any other XPs on the group, would love to have you in that. So I think as a woman who's leading other women, there's a couple suggestions I have. The first is that you want to make sure that you're stewarding your leadership well so that you're not being the only mentor for the women leaders on your team. And that's not a statement about you. That's a statement about the church's propensity to assign gender mentors to developing leaders. And there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't work. The biggest one is that you will be exhausted by trying to develop every woman on your team. But we don't work with just women, and men don't work with just men, which is why we need each other, and we have to be able to speak into it. Just like I was telling Scott with his little girls, to learn how to work with multiple generations. The best thing we can do for all of our leaders is to put them in the same leadership development systems, integrate them with each other so that we learn skills from one another rather than separately. So that would be the first thing. So making sure they have plenty of not just female leaders, but also male leaders who are giving them honest, critical feedback, are positioning them for advancement, are promoting them, and being on their teams. It's just easy for sometimes, and I'm saying this more generically to everybody, it's easy for the one female leader to have all the women leaders flock to her team, and you have this little subset of like an elevated women's ministry in the midst of the rest of the church. And the goal is we don't want any churches within the church. We want integrated churches that are harnessing the power of diversity in all of our ministries. I would say the same to children's ministry. You don't want just moms volunteering and on your leadership team in children's ministries. You need dads, and student ministries also needs moms. We want everybody at the table. And then the second thing I would say is to really help them develop peer networks. One of the biggest limitations for women in male-populated environments, by the way, I decided to stop calling it male-dominated because I don't think that shares the heart correctly of the guys that I know, but male-populated environments, is that they lack female networks. And networking is a huge piece. Not networking like you go to a social network and have a cocktail hour or whatever, grape juice hour, and you do your thing, networking. I'm talking about like, I'm stuck about how to say this in my meeting in 10 minutes. And I have a friend who I feel close enough to that I can call and get some advice and unstick my mind so I can move forward with my day. That kind of networking. It's why we developed the Female Executive Pastor Network, because when we started that 10 years ago, there were 35 of us across the United States. And so it helped to be able to have a friend that had a lot more affinity with to ask those more vulnerable questions than I could to the guy who was going to be sitting in my meeting that I was running. So helping them form peer networks across the organization, because it doesn't work if you're all just in worship ministry and you ask each other. You want to take the worship gal and connect her to the woman who works in finance, and also connect her to the woman who runs missions and the person who leads student ministry things. Put them in a 4-part cohort for 6 months and have them read a book together. You've just created a mini network that's going to last them probably for years.
Thank you so much. And I am in that WXP. I was at
you are? Okay, I haven't seen you there yet.
Where you weren't able to be there. I've been praying for your mom. And
thank you.
But yeah, so that's a great group.
Okay, thanks so much. That's a great question.
Just as a note too, any resources referred to, whether it's in our group call, whether it's a book, whether it's a network that Kadi refers to, like her XP Female Leader Network, we will send a follow-up with a notation on all these resources. So if you miss anything, don't even worry. We're going to send you a good follow-up. Lorraine, I want to let you ask the question that you sent in.
Thank you. As someone who didn't grow up with that sort of early affirmation of leadership gifts, and who is growing into them and developing them and discovering them at a later age, how do you what is the key to overcoming that imposter syndrome, especially when you're in an environment that has kind of the old boys club, and your personality doesn't necessarily fit in with that kind of old boys club personality?
Yes. Oh, Lorraine, that is a great question. And I would just say that is something that almost every woman leader struggles with at some level. It's not really that you have it or don't have it. It's more about to what degree. And so the great thing about imposter syndrome, it's like any other stronghold in our mind or in our faith journey, that over time we can actually gain victory over it. But it requires a few key disciplines. And the reason I connect it to the other parts of our spiritual journey is I think for most people in general, developing your gifts and learning how to step into the calling God has given you is always the most vulnerable faith step. Next to salvation, it's the place that seems the most personal. It's hard to know what's my gifting, what's just me. Am I making a mistake? Doesn't everybody know how to do this? So part of what we do to overcome imposter syndrome is get really honest with ourselves about ourselves. And there's two kinds of input you need from that. One, you need self-reflection. Who am I? Who do I know myself to be? Who does God say I am? What is true about me? What are the experiences God has brought about me? What are the identity in Christ things that I need to remind myself about? All of those pieces are kind of like our own view of ourselves. And then we need feedback from other people. In fact, I think the Bible, for me, when I look at spiritual gifting in the New Testament, I feel like scripture is really clear that there are certain gifts, and a huge way we find out what our gifting is the affirmation of other people, and also, the discouragement of other people that says you should not do that again. And so getting feedback from other people. Now, interestingly, statistically, women get much less critical and helpful feedback than men get in most environments. So when a woman gets feedback from something, let's say you give the announcements on the weekend and talk about the upcoming whatever people can sign up for. When a woman gets done with doing a step like that, that's especially a leadership-oriented step, she tends to get what's called general or vague praise. So congrats, good job, so glad to have you up there. And it can kind of make you feel good for a minute, but it doesn't actually help you grow and develop as a leader. Because the whole time you can be like, and we know Christian circles, like, we're really nice people. So telling me I did a good job, I've seen you say good job to someone I thought was horrible. So that doesn't actually have any value to me. When guys get up and do any sort of leadership moment, they tend to get much more constructive feedback. So it's like, hey, great job on the announcements, but I'd love to give you a couple suggestions. One, you took 13 minutes and you're only supposed to take 3. So you got to cut that down. Next time you do it, I want you to not wear, whatever, the plaid shirt that looked horrible on the camera. And I want you to always connect the announcement to vision. Remember, this is the vision of our church, and everything we talk about has to connect to vision. So when you do that next time, that's what I want to see you do. And record yourself, because then you can watch yourself do it, right? 4 really specific things, plus the promise that he's going to get the chance to do it again. When most women do something, what goes on in their mind is that was the last time I'll ever do it. I'm so glad God gave me the chance to do that just once. They never imagine themselves getting more and more opportunity, let alone actually getting better and better and better at it. So for you and all of us who struggle with this, getting and convincing people you want real feedback. Was I good at this? Do you think I should keep doing announcements? If I were to do it again, what would you say I should do differently? What do you think I should do the same? Now, the hard part about this is that it's not comfortable to give feedback. It feels bad. Most of us would rather kind of just take the easy route out and just say, 15 people told me I did good. Whew, I must have done good, right? But deep down, when you're a leader, leaders long to grow. Leaders long to learn. Leaders instinctively know there is more in them that God wants to use. There's more they can do. There's more people they can touch. There's more that they can carry. There's more responsibility that they can have. Leaders are hungry people. And so when you go after feedback, you're giving yourself the feedback that might not be coming to you normally, but in that you're going to get the affirmation and the next steps you need to overcome those sticky floor and imposter syndrome pieces. The 2 pieces that I like to talk about when it comes to sticky floor and imposter syndrome is to always remember there's 2 sides to the coin when you talk about yourself or think about yourself or get feedback about yourself. One side is that you want to be really honest. Really honest. Most women, when someone asks them kind of the leadership question that feels them out, like, hey, tell me about yourself. A woman goes, well, I'm married and have some kids, and I like to quilt and da 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 da. But be fully honest. If you've led something, then tell them you've led something. Don't lie. Don't inflate. Don't be prideful. Most women are very scaredful of like overselling themselves. So don't oversell, but don't undersell either. To oversell or undersell yourself is actually to be dishonest. So just be honest. So I can come in, and it's not easy, but even beforehand, I told Darren, I said, okay, Darren, most people are not good at introducing women. So let me tell you a few key things that will make a difference for me, right? So I'm advocating for myself, but it feels weird to say, hey, please tell them I have a master's degree in this. Like, there's a reason I'm on this call. They may not realize it, and I don't feel like I belong here, but there's a good reason why I'm here. I did this thing at a church. Yes, it was a few years ago. I'm not doing it today, but that doesn't mean I didn't do it and know a lot and can add something. So being really honest about who we are, and it's okay to be honest about who you're not. And then the flip side is to be honoring. So when someone gives you negative feedback, or even critical feedback that might be true but isn't easy, is to be honoring of that and to be appreciative of that. If your boss doesn't want to give you a promotion, to honor his view, but to know that you don't have to agree with it. Honor and honesty are the two main pieces that carry women through the developmental task of overcoming those sticky floor issues.
That's so good, Katie.
Thank you so much.
Christy, I think Katie kind of touched on your question there as well. Did that answer your question? Okay, that's great. I want to encourage you to keep sending in some questions and keep putting them in the chat. And as we do that, I'm going to open up this leadership conversation a little bit. Jeff, you sent in ahead of time, boy, a big question that on some front all of us are wrestling with right now. So why don't you throw that by Katie as we extend our leadership conversation?
If I could only remember exactly what I said.
You had just talked about there's just some big conversations happening right now that you as a leader need to deal with that are divisive and tough to handle, and just some insight on that.
Yeah, it seems that that's just been such a running thing. It almost isn't a question anymore. It's just a way of life. Yeah, there's just the challenge of people seem to be so polarized on so many issues. And everybody has opinions, everybody has viewpoints. In wrangling all of those while trying to honor the masses. And as a pastor, the biggest issue for me has been, how do we reopen and how do we honor all sides of the coin?
Mm-hmm.
Mask, no mask, social distance, indoor, outdoor, all those kinds of things, when I've got people that are on the far side of, oh, this is just a hoax, to this side saying, well, I'm scared to go out of my house. So, I mean, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but that was kind of where I was dealing with it. So.
Yes, there's nodding happening all over the Zoom call. I think everybody gets this. Well, and I know I'm just shocked that something like masks could turn into a divisive political issue somehow. I don't know how that works, but yeah, I think, any kind of leadership, particularly in a crisis, is always going to have different viewpoints because we all deal with crisis differently. If any of you have ever done like Dave Ramsey or worked with a financial planner, whenever you're about to invest any money, they always have you do a risk profile analysis to see how open to risk you are. And of course, the more open you are, the more aggressive you can be with your investments. And the more open to risk you are, the more you're okay losing all your money in a week and then knowing you'll bounce back. And then there's the other extreme, which is like, I only want to buy bonds and I don't want to ever lose any money. And I'm good at earning 6 cents a year, and somewhere in the middle, most of us are. When you're leading a church, it's a very unique environment. It's different than really any other kind of leadership, maybe other than government, because you actually have everyone in every spectrum across the board. Most businesses, especially because of all the work we've done on culture building in the last 15 years, tend to have a segment of people that sort of fit the culture. So it's a little easier to run. But when you're operating a church or a family or a community, you have everyone across the spectrum. And so the first thing to remember is that there is no one magical thing that's going to actually help everybody feel great. And it isn't even like I'm going to disappoint someone. I mean, like there literally is no strategy that will meet everyone's inner need for safety and security, which in a crisis is always the number one thing we go to, right? How can I be safe? And for some people, safety is, I want to be physically safe. I don't want to get sick. And so I'm going to stay home, or I'm going to do these things, or I'm only going to wear a mask, or I won't hang out with those people that I saw on social media, go to the movies or whatever, right? It's physical safety. Other people, though, their safety is in more about the rule of law. And is there order in my streets? I could care less about the disease. I don't even think that's an issue. I'm scared someone's going to break into my business, or I'm scared there's going to be a riot and our government is going to go down, right? So everyone's got a different sense of safety. My advice would be to make sure you're speaking to the safety concern. That if you can always recenter things back on speaking to people's safety and security, that we first have in the Lord, that we second have by being smart about our practices, and third, that we're taking care of a whole congregation that has a lot of needs. And we're always going to take care of the least of these first. We're always going to care most about the most vulnerable because we're the church. And that's what our job is. If you can frame people back to why we make decisions and what the most important things in my opinion, you'll get the majority of people to, even if they don't agree with you, they'll understand it. And if they know their Bible, they're going to agree with the priorities, because that's what a shepherd does, right? A shepherd protects the flock. You could even use that as the teaching. My job is the shepherd. My job is to protect everyone. If we lose one, we go after it, right? This is what we do. And that's how we have community and love one another. So we all have different preferences. And so we're going to give a lot of options, but our goal is that you get the option that you feel the safest and you know is right for you and your family. Does that make sense, or is that helpful?
No, absolutely. And we sent out a very comprehensive survey in advance to
Smart.
get feedback, and that's the direction we went. Very conservative responses, so we went with very conservative reaction. And I guess I'm of the ilk that I would love everybody to always like me and my decisions. We know that that's not reality.
Oh, I think that's going to be the leadership experience when we get to heaven. I'm convinced of it. I think those of us with leadership gifts, our gifts come alive in heaven too. And so we're going to lead and everyone's going to say, brilliant, let's all go. And it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
Larry Osborne speaks wonderfully into this. I'll see if I can find the video.
That is good.
But he speaks wonderfully into this on how to handle this. And he really speaks to what Kadi alluded to, that the magic is the word "and." That it's not one or the other, we're going to do and. And he even described how they started opening up some opportunities for those that, as you described, Jeff, are eager. Why wouldn't we be having these kind of gatherings? We'll start creating some of those. And we really want to make sure and shepherd all of those you who are a little nervous. And he said, and protect safety. And he said, one of the things they made sure to do as leadership, and he said, this was the key, is we as leaders stressed how we were still going to be sitting in those places as well. So Larry described how they would make an announcement, he or Chris Brown, okay, we're going to start having some smaller gatherings, but for those of you not comfortable, we're still encouraging you. Our online is a primary place of gathering, and I just want you to know that's where I'm going to be on Sunday as well. And so that way, they legitimized how the shepherding of the flock by not somehow making them the lesser by staying home and not engaging more, but actually that's where I am as well, because that's where I'm most comfortable at this time. And then all of those who they're shepherding who were nervous and vulnerable, as Kadi described, just felt so loved and cared for. And I think that's really critical. We don't just note it, we sit with them in that same place.
I do think that if you've done, which I'm sure you have, converted any of your offerings online, my thought is that I don't think online is going away anytime soon. And so making it a normal part of what you offer, one of your options, just like you might have multiple Sunday services, you now also have an online service that is just as legitimate. And from a church staffing standpoint, making sure you're staffing it and funding it appropriately to the numbers that are there. So if you have half your church online and half are in your room, I would encourage you to make sure you've got a good bit of your staffing and dollars going to the online environment and giving it high quality, great audio, real intentional creativity, because it is going to be around to stay. My previous career, I was a nurse. And so I know from epidemiology that this is not our first pandemic, and it's not our last pandemic. So this is going to be this is a new reality for us. And so how we steward our online engagement and giving ourselves the agility and flexibility to maneuver back and forth is going to be I believe is going to be one of the litmus tests of the churches that make it through the future.
The other thing Larry noted just on what Kadi is talking about is, and of course this varies by region as to where you are and reopening and so forth. But Larry said that the big communication we've made as a church at North Coast is that we are now an online church that also has live gatherings, or also will have live gatherings. We are not a church that has live gatherings and we also have online. This has changed who we are as a church, and that legitimizes again what Kadi is just pointing to. We are an online church now, because we don't want those who start engaging with us online feeling like they were just for a moment in time and not anymore. So we just have 1 minute left here, and I want to give a chance for you to go. I know we didn't answer every question that everyone had, but I hope this hit on some really important things for you. And I know that if you had a follow-up question that you wanted to send to Katie, I know that she would probably be thrilled to interact. I'm speaking for her, but I think she'd probably
Please just send me an email. Yes.
so we'll include her email in the follow-up to this, and you can send her a question. And I also want to encourage you, again, Katie is such an exceptional leader that if there's something more formal, this is no part of this call, but if there's something more formal, I always want to champion Katie because she's brilliant.
Thanks.
So if she can more formally consult or help your church or your leadership or you, then have that conversation with her and ask her, what would that look like, Katie, to do this a little more formally, and see if she has some space for that. But thank you so much for being on this call. I hope it's been a blessing for you. We'll follow up with resources, and we'll just keep providing you opportunities to get around the circle to get the answers you need. So thanks for being with us, everyone. Blessings, and we'll keep praying for you as you're leading in tough places.
Thanks, everybody. Great to be with you. Bye.
Thank you, Katie and Darren.
Thank you very much.